I am so happy today because we have a dynamic speaker. Linda Karanzalis is a former special educator and board certified cognitive specialist. In 1997, she founded the ADDvantages Learning Center, one of the first in the US to meet the needs of neurodivergent population. Linda's the ambassador for the NVLD Project, a national nonprofit organization dedicated to improving the lives of those with NVLD. She's also the author of an amazing book, very informative, very inspirational, and I highly recommend it to all parents and professionals. What I love about it is Linda gives her own view of her experience as a child, as a teen, as an adult, battling with an undiagnosed nonverbal learning disability. Welcome, Linda.
Wow, thank you for having me. What a great introduction. Thanks.
Okay, so we're going to jump right into it.
Okay, jump right into it.
What I'd love you to do is tell us a little bit about your story and why you wrote this amazing book.
Well, this is the book that I wish I would have had when I was struggling and there was nothing known at the time. So life was just not working for me. Since childhood, I really struggled. And I thought I was dumb, thought I was stupid. And I was determined to help other people that struggled like I did. So I never really thought I would go to college because I was told I was, like a lot of people were told, they're not college material. And but I have a strong drive and a passion, and that's really it's a blessing. And so I had a friend at the time, and she pushed me into going to college, and I started at the age of 22. And I'm like, oh my gosh, they are going to kick me out because, you know, I was not the best student going through school. I really struggled. But as like most late bloomers do, when they really know that they want something and they hone in on it, they can be really successful. I just needed more maturity before I started college. So I became a special ed teacher. And I started keeping notes, and I was like, you know, some of this doesn't add up, and some of these kids have the same symptoms as me. And back then, we didn't really learn about ADHD in college, so I figured out I had ADHD. And then, but something else, and a lot of the kids struggled with what I was struggling with growing up, was social skills and understanding what people were saying. And I have examples of that in the book. So
let me show the book.
Thank you.
I haven't. So it's misnamed, misdiagnosed, misunderstood.
I can see you have like pages marked and everything.
Oh, I have everything. This is my Bible. I love it. I'm going to share more about me with this book, but this is just going to, it's exploding now, and it's just going to change the landscape for everybody. I cannot tell you what a blessing this book is for all of us.
Oh, thank you. I really feel that it was inspired by God. I always knew I was supposed to write a book, but you know, I just didn't know when. So anyway, back to the story. So I left teaching. I had tenure and I left because I thought, how can I teach in a system that doesn't really understand the kids I'm teaching? I'm spending all day, you know, teaching kids how to get along with each other before they could even learn, because a lot of the kids I had, you know, were just thrown in together, like dyslexia with severe mental problems. And so I said, there's got to be a better way to teach these kids than just strategies and reteaching over and over and over. And so I did a lot of research, and I left, and I started my own consulting practice. And then I started ADDvantages Learning Center, and I was inundated because I was the only one. There was no social emotional learning curriculums. There was no organizations. So I had my own materials that I had developed. And I had parents coming from all over the place. And I also didn't just do strategies, which I'll explain. And so, you know, I was really able to help a lot of people. And then I was working, you know, I've worked with hundreds and hundreds, probably like, you know, thousands by the time over the years. And because I had people trained to do my methods that worked for me. And I said, I have to write this book because COVID actually gave me the opportunity to do it, because I was always so busy, because I can't reach everybody. And, you know, I'm one person, and I wanted to help the masses of people. And so I have a Facebook support group called NVLD Pioneers, because I truly felt like a pioneer, because I was like, had to find my own way, and I
You're a
had to make my
trailblazer.
own path.
A
Yes,
pioneer, but a
right.
trailblazer. Yeah.
And everything that I do with my clients, adults and kids, I did for myself, and that's how I improved. So I feel like my purpose in life is to help people suffer. It seems to be to help them suffer, not as much as I did.
Right.
So I can give you the cliff notes and tell you what to do.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
Yeah.
amazing.
Because there really is no protocol or treatment for NVLD yet. A lot of the interventions for other disorders, which we'll talk about, can be used, but they're not enough, because NVLD is different. And so they still have to be developed. But
Okay.
I have, my own, things that I have developed.
So, Linda, what I'd love you to do is talk about the slap that was heard around the world during the Oscars, because that to me is such a genuine example of NVLD.
Yes. And we can only I want to be careful to say we can only speculate, because Chris Rock has not spoken out about it. He said he was still processing it, but we know that in 2020 he was diagnosed with NVLD, and he did do a great service to come out and say that to the public, because we desperately needed someone with notoriety to bring attention to this. So I'm really grateful to him. So what happened was, there's a lot of debate, but nobody would expect on national TV to be slapped. I mean, no one. So there's an element of, was it just that he was caught by surprise? But it's typical of what happened with NVLD, because when Will Smith was talking in the audience, I believe he didn't pick up the tone, or maybe he thought it was a joke at first. But, again, I'm speculating. And because, 38% of communication is tone of voice. So if you're not picking up the tone that was sarcastic, that was not nice, that he was very upset, because, usually people with NVLD are literal. So the words were literal. So he was getting that. But maybe at that point, he just didn't know that, maybe he just thought it was funny or something. But had he been able to pick up the tone, he would have known. And the facial expressions, because with NVLD, it's nonverbal communication. It sounds like we don't speak because of the name, but people with NVLD are very well spoken. I'm just explaining that a little to get to the story, and are articulate, but the name is misleading to think that you don't speak, but it means you don't process nonverbal communication, facial expressions, gestures, tone of voice, which the research is anywhere from 60 to 93% that communication is nonverbal. So that leaves you with a very small portion of what you're understanding, and meaning you take things literally, because those nonverbal cues, the things I mentioned, can completely change the meaning of the words.
Yeah, and also as Will Smith was approaching him, he wasn't able to
he wasn't able to read it, and we're talking about the stance of his body, the pacing of his walk, the way his body looked, all these things. And as he got closer, your body will automatically, we don't think about it, when we're threatened, we're going to protect ourselves. We're not thinking, just like driving, we're not thinking, let me just steer here and put the brake on here. We're just doing it. It's an automatic response. There was no automatic response of his body to protect himself. Now, some would say, okay, well, maybe he didn't want to get into a brawl on television, which is a good thing to do, not to fight back. But because that wasn't there, that was another indicator. And he just looked so surprised and so taken up. And then afterwards, later on, when I think they were presenting another award, they showed his face and he looked so confused, which is typical of people with NVLD. And, so the positive thing was, even though it was humiliating for him and that he was attacked, was I give him a lot of credit, because he really hasn't said much about it, and he's handling himself well. If there's a positive to come out of the negative, is the awareness, because it went through the roof. The Google searches just went ballistic after that. So
I
because it was
also
heard
heard
around the world, you know?
I also heard from another professional that they were watching the talk. And I don't know if you've heard this story, but Joy Behar was saying she was at a party with Chris Rock.
Yes, yes,
You heard that story?
yes. And
Gave her a lift home,
mm-hmm.
and
And
she
he
got
said,
on the telephone and ignored her during the
yes,
whole drive home. And she
yes,
couldn't understand why.
right. Because he didn't know, because he didn't, you're not picking up on things, just like a lot of people with NVLD. And again, it's not a cookie cutter diagnosis. It is so different for everyone that not everybody fits it the same way. But, you know, I had someone that I worked with once, and if somebody would say, "How are you?" which is, take that literally. So this person would tell them, well, if they weren't feeling well, all their ailments, or a problem, well, this is happening and that's happening. They might even ask for it, but how are you doesn't mean that. It's
Yeah,
just a social pleasantry and a way to connect.
yeah. They would just offer
Right.
too much
But
information.
once you know that, because it's not all doom and gloom with intervention, once you know that, then, you know, you go ahead and you learn not to do that.
Yeah, right. What would you like parents and professionals to understand about NVLD?
First, I want them to know that it's, you know, like with all other learning disabilities, it is invisible and it does slip through the cracks, because it can look like someone is lazy or unmotivated. And a lot of times there's heavily misdiagnosis with ADHD. And so if you have an ADHD diagnosis, I mean, it's like virtually everyone that's diagnosed with NVLD had that diagnosis first. It's really important to know, because ADHD, there's a lot of overlap. But can you imagine, you know, nobody ever really wants to be on medication. Of course, if you need to be on it, that's fine. You know, like if you have, you know, diabetes or a heart condition and you need it to function, but it does nothing for NVLD.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of people that are on medication that don't need it. There's recent research that 3 to 4% of the population have NVLD, so parents need to know that. About half are misdiagnosed as ADHD, and the remaining are undiagnosed. So to really, if you think something is going on, to pay attention to the signs and the symptoms, but you might not know what they are. So you you know, can do your research, do your, you know, do as much research as you can, educate yourself, because a lot of the professionals don't even know. I just had somebody that their kid had a neuropsych, and this professional was baffled and didn't know what to do and how to diagnose this, and actually did some research and then said, okay, this is what it is. But that's not always the case of what happens. So I want parents to know to look at their neuropsychs and their evaluations, and look at the verbal IQ and the performance IQ, which is now called perceptual reasoning, which is really visual spatial, and see if there's a gap. Is the verbal much higher? Because people with NVLD usually, you know, are above average IQ in verbal expression, but they're lower in performance, which is, or perceptual reasoning, which is visual spatial, and that's going to be a big clue. And then you can investigate that further. Also, in my book, I talk about not judging a book by a cover. There's a, you know, first impressions in our world are really important. You know, you never get a second chance to make a first impression. And when you, especially if there's research, when you're exceptionally attractive, and especially with being articulate, we judge people by the way they speak. Oh, they're well spoken, you know, they're above average. They're, that we expect more of other people then. And so that makes it harder for people with NVLD, because the expectations are higher.
Yes.
And then they're expecting them to behave one way, and they're not behaving as a neurotypical. And then, like, I give an example in the book of one parent, and so people thought that this kid was just spoiled, you know, she was indulging him and she was a bad parent because he was very good looking, he was very well spoken, but the behavior didn't match up, because it's not a behavioral disorder, it's a neurological disorder. So don't judge a book by its cover. And if you're seeing some of these things, do some more investigation. A lot of parents, like, and you and professionals, well, parents really are buying like more than one copy, and they're giving it to the whole child study team, to teachers, to the OTs and PTs, and to the gym teachers, because with the visual spatial, all the signs are there.
Yeah.
and those professionals will see it. You know, and some kids might even fall out of their chair because they can't judge, you know, distances or their balance. You know, they may have dyspraxia, which is known as developmental coordination disorder, and they may think they're just being smart, you know, and, you know, they're coming out of their chair, falling out of their chair. And look for the masks, because everybody wants to be seen as competent. And so there's a lot of shame. There's research that people with ADHD, kids with ADHD, get 20,000 more negative messages than those who aren't kids, I think by the age of 12. Now, we don't have research for NVLD, but we can imagine that it's similar. So there's a lot of masking going on and pressure to appear like everyone else is neurotypical. So that could be anything from like a class clown. I think Chris Rock did that, and a lot of comedians did that. To being like, for me, I was always sick. I always had to go to the nurse's office. Or some kids are the rebel, you know, or some kids are a know-it-all. Or so look for those. When you see those behaviors, don't assume they're behavioral. Look for neurological reasons of the problems coping. So there's a lot of anxiety. Kids could have a lot of anxiety. They might be misdiagnosed as oppositional defiant disorder because they ask a lot of questions. Be wary if they ask a lot of questions. My father used to say, "Are you a detective? Or are you writing a book?" Because they need to ask those questions. Because if you wear glasses and you take them away, people can't function optimally. They have to ask questions because that's how they're operating from. They're not getting all the other nonverbal.
Right. That's right.
So ask, and a lot of teachers think, and I just had this happen. One kid, and this happens all the time, like they may be right and they may correct the teacher. You know, and Sue Thompson did a lot of early research. She's since passed away on NVLD, but she was that's how I discovered that I had it, by reading her book. She gives an example where a kid just gets like a little adult and gets on the intercom and tells everybody what to do. Because they don't know the boundaries. You know, they're not picking everything up, that you're not supposed to do that. So teachers may really not like them and think that they're making them look foolish, being oppositional defiant. And
challenging the teachers, right?
Yeah, challenging, asking a lot of questions. But, you know, that's one of the signs. And like they always say, like, you know, like a dog with a bone, and they're, you know, getting upset. I used to do this, and I see a lot of people do this. You didn't say that. That's not what you said. You said that. Meaning they only got your words. So they did not read between the lines and make inferences. So then they can appear argumentative, and if you're a parent finding, well, I know that's what I said, but this is what I meant, that's another sign to look for. So, and to understand that it's not an intellectual disability, that some of these interventions will help that other disorders that are similar, which we'll talk about, but some of them won't, and to understand that, and that there is a stigma. You know, that unfortunately anything that's invisible, you may not be treated fairly. Like Judith Singer, years ago, she developed this term neurodivergent, those who think and do things differently and behave differently, because she saw that those on the spectrum were being discriminated against, just like non-whites and people with different sexual orientations, that it wasn't fair. And so that unfortunately happens a lot. So to be aware that, you know, just because someone thinks or does things differently, that could be another sign. So do your research, investigate, and then, you know, look for that VIPIQ performance thing and the things we talked about, and then, you know, go to a neuropsychologist that knows about NVLD and can discern this from other disorders, which is, you have to do your research on that. Example in the book where the one mom knew about the NVLD, and then she questioned the psychologist, and she said, yes, you know, I do diagnose that. And then she went back like to her a year later, and then she didn't diagnose it because the kid had previously been diagnosed with it. And she goes, oh, I work for myself now. It's not in the DSM. I don't believe in it. So she didn't get the diagnosis, which is a catch-22, because, you know, you need that diagnosis. So many are being labeled on the spectrum to get some of these interventions that do help, but not all. And so she kind of wanted the NVLD diagnosis too, but it's just a catch-22. You can get it if you break down, well, sometimes you can get it under not under specified, or you can get it if you break down like dysgraphia, dyslexia, dyscalculia on
Okay.
those individual that can comprise NVLD.
Yeah, because, many of the kids are having difficulty with math, right?
Math is right, the number one. I think it's, I forget there was, is it 2/3 of with math? But especially word problems, that's a big sign. And and difficulty with math, yes. So don't assume that the schools are going to understand it. You're going to have to, it's that's why the book's called Misnamed, Misdiagnosed, Misunderstood. Professionals may not know. And when researchers Jessica Breitman and Amy Margolis and some other researchers did this study that almost 3 million people have it under the age of 18, United States and Canada, and it's like 3 to 4% of the population, they were astounded. So they need, so more research is needed. We don't know about over the age of 18. So be an advocate and speak up and educate others and try to figure it out and be your own detective and ask your own questions.
And there's some early signs also that, early intervention is so important,
Right.
Is your child an early walker? Do they have difficulty crawling? Is it a scoot? Is it a belly crawl? Can they tie shoelaces, right?
Right. And when I was working in a preschool handicapped, I had a little girl that did not want to move, but she could move. And sometimes she would just refuse to move. We'd have to pick her up. Okay, we didn't know about this. Some people thought it was a behavior problem, but I could see that she didn't have the sequencing down, the organization. And when that's another sign in preschool, when you're doing those movement in the circle time, you're doing the songs and the movement in your body, you're going to see that they can't do that. They can't move their feet. They can't sequence their hands. And that's that visual spatial thing, bumping into people, standing too close, things like that. So you're going to see some of that, but it slips through the cracks because the pediatricians don't know about it. The teachers don't know about it. And if the kid is well behaved, it's only when they stand out when they really, have behavior problems. And nobody really can pick up on it. Sometimes an OT or PT will pick up on it, like if they're in early intervention, and they'll treat that, but they won't really know the reason of it. And again, that's a kid that needs a lot of verbal explanation. But sometimes it's not picked up because remember, NVLD is not a cookie cutter diagnosis. It's anywhere from mild, moderate to severe. It looks different with people. And so as you're going to see is as they get older, sometimes it's not identified till middle school, 5th grade, and sometimes earlier. Early, not be able to use scissors, tying shoes, like you said. Sports, catching the ball, running, they're afraid of the ball because they can't, it's that visual motor coordination. Handwriting could be all over the place. But really they're going to hit a wall when it goes more from the concrete to the abstract. In the beginning, school's kind of easier. They still may struggle academically, but when it gets to independent thinking and, they get all the details and they're literal, but putting them together for the overall big picture and the premise, that's when you're going to see it, when you have to be more independent. The teachers aren't helping you as much. And that's middle school. They can hit a wall. And then you have to look for a lot of mental, emotional problems, anxiety, because that's the byproduct of NVLD. The anxiety is so high. Can you imagine not understanding what's going on and faking it to not bring attention to yourself? I put in my book, I always felt like I was walking on jello. I never knew what to expect. I mean, ulcers, not wanting to go to school. And a kid, you don't know what's wrong. It's like walking on ice and you don't know with each step if you're going to fall through or you're not. So there's a lot of anxiety as well. And, you could be diagnosed, or if you have OCD, it could be triggered because under stress you regress. So you have to, those other misdiagnoses, can happen as well.
I was diagnosed, Linda, with ADHD for years, early years. And I always knew that there was a piece. I always, when I started reading about nonverbal, I always suspected it because it just sounded, especially when they weren't able to, they weren't able to read my cues. They'd say to me, "Mother, why are you angry?" when I wasn't angry. Communication was so difficult.
Did you see that, the story in the book where I talk about that? And I would ask my mom, why are you mad? Are you mad? Are you mad? And she, no, but finally she was like, now I'm mad because she keep asking. I couldn't pick up her tone or her, and if a resting or neutral face is really hard, you just don't know. But I want to go back because I had this, the statistic written down. It's 10 to 15% have math difficulties.
Wow.
Wanted to correct that. And 1/3 to 2/3, this is newer information I just heard from Jessica Breitman, and I forget his name, Dr. Russell, that 1/3 to 2/3 have, you know, ADHD and anxiety with it because it's comorbid. Because usually when you have one disorder or learning disability, you have another one. And you can see how it's really hard to, like with a fine-tooth comb, to figure all these things out.
Yeah. And so I was going to ask you, so how is NVLD similar and how is it differentiated from ADHD or even, you know, mild autism disorder?
Well, that, you know, that's, sometimes I say people get so hung up on that. I'm like, do you really need to know? Because sometimes you do want to know because it's like a light bulb, and then, you know, okay, this is different. This is how I can help my kid. But for people that can't get the diagnosis, you just want to look at the symptoms and see what you can do, because there's so many people walking around that aren't getting the right help. But how can you know? Yes, it is important to know. While ADHD is more chemical, it's about dopamine. So it's about starting, task initiation, and that's the same with there's just so many overlapping symptoms.
Yeah.
Executive functioning, planning, prioritizing, controlling your impulses, knowing how you're coming across to others. That's called metacognition. Self-monitoring, organization, time management. See, those things are in common. But someone with ADHD needs that excitement and interest to get started on something, because that is the dopamine. So parents may say, oh, well, you can pick and choose what you want to do when you want to do a video game or whatnot, but that's very stimulating and it releases the dopamine that you need to focus. Those with NVLD, it's not a chemical problem. They're not going to be able to focus even if they're highly interested in something. Yes, they may try harder because they really want to do it, but that's the difference. More difficulty with ADHD, you can miss social skills and cues because you're not focused growing up. You learn it by visual observation.
Right.
But with NVLD, it's because they don't have a visual spatial deficit unless they have both. With NVLD, it's what we just talked about, not picking up on all that, because you're not learning from visual observation, not because you're not focused, because it's coming from coming from the brain, not a chemical problem, a structural problem.
And it impacts the right, it's the right brain, right?
It's the right brain weakness of that hemisphere, which is like this theory of neuronal white matter. And it's the connection between the corpus callosum and the right to the left hemisphere. So the connection isn't really there. And that's the whole visual spatial thing. And that's where your occipital lobe is. And, but again, they're both in common, or all three could have executive functioning, which is the prefrontal cortex of the brain. So the ADHD and NVLD can have that impairment, and, you know, with autism, it could be too. You know, and that's everything I just talked about, all the executive functioning. Now, people on the spectrum have really good visual spatial processing skills. You know, I had a kid that knew how to get around New York, could tell you every single connection, subway, bus thing, read a map. People with NVLD have difficulty reading maps, knowing where they are in space. Like when I go to a conference, I have to get the lay of the land and I have to practice it and I have to know where I am. One conference I went to, the whole time I was walking around, and you have to have a sense of humor because it's frustrating, this long way to get to where I needed to go. So especially in hotels, when every floor looks the same and it's the same wallpaper, it's the same carpeting. So you have to familiarize yourself with that. You have to familiarize yourself on college campuses, because like when I was in college, I knew all the names of the buildings, but I had to do that ahead of time. I go from here to there to there. When you're in middle school and you're changing classes, you need to do that before school starts, because then the kids will get demerits and they'll have detentions. And remember, they're trying to carry everything and they have coordination problems, so they can be late to class from that and getting lost around the building. And all the lockers look alike. Right. So, and that could look like a behavior thing, being late. But those on the spectrum are very good visually, spatially. So that's the difference. I mean, I've had kids on college campuses get lost. A lot of this is in the book.
Right.
So it is a brain-based problem, and but those with the autism, and they have smaller spleniums than those on the spectrum. They have brain scans. So they have the research on that as well. So the thing we really want to know is because not all the interventions will help in the treatment, and we can get to talk about what you can do. But I do want to say there's a lot of strengths. You can be successful. Remember, just like ADHD, it could be mild, moderate to severe. If you get early identification, if you get help right away, excellent researchers, excellent speakers, fluent readers, early talkers. Now, sometimes they don't comprehend everything or make inferences, good at spelling, good vocabulary, but again, everybody's different. So we can't, put it in the cookie cutter, but it's not a behavioral problem. You have to look at it like it's a neurological, developmental problem. Okay.
Strategies are so important, and parents want to hear how they can help.
Okay, so I have a bunch of strategies here. There's a lot of them. First of all, some of them are different because, again, we don't have the research for them. But from my knowledge and based on, because this is what I specialize in, this in ADHD and, autism level 1, which many identify with as Asperger's, is, a lot of the same. Well, first of all, let me go back. There's strategies, okay, which are good, but they are not enough. The executive functioning is a very big buzzword now. We've known about it for years. We've all known about it, but everybody now really knows about it in the mainstream. So it's like executive functioning, this and that. Really, it's nothing different than strategies. And strategies are, all these things that you do to make life more easier and automatic. Like, you can use timers, you can color code, you can sit to the front of the room. You can verbally, and if you have trouble writing, you can talk to the teacher and give the test. If you're an adult, you can do things like get all the same colored socks and the same style. You can have laundry bins, because remember, it's executive functioning, because their rooms are typically really messy. And the other thing is they're really messy eaters, which I wanted to bring up, because when my father, who I believe is NVLD, wherever I ate, there were crumbs on the floor, on the table, everything on my shirt. I still carry a Tide stick, although I'm a lot better today. I even got my dad a bib, because we're Italian and we would, eat a lot of gravy. Italians call it gravy. And, but it was all visual motor. Think about it, holding a fork, depth perception, all that. Right. So I don't know how I got on this, because you asked me, that was one of the strategies. Okay. Making things automatic and easier. Getting your clothes out, maybe your outfits together. Wearing a uniform is great for adults. There's so many decisions to be made, and even for kids. That's why, it's great when schools have uniforms. Why stress out for us over these major, all these little decisions that are the same every day? Try to make them automatic. And people that are successful know this. You don't have to have NVLD or a learning disorder. Steve Jobs, Mark, the guy Zuckerman from Facebook, they all wear the same thing, because they have so much on their mind, they know what they're going to wear. He always wore the turtleneck and this. And so I do that too, a lot of times. It just depends. So those are like strategies, and they vary per adults and kids and age levels. But by the time a kid really needs these strategies, they are burned out and emotionally burned out and depressed, usually, and anxious, because they have been so misunderstood. They've been given all that extra negative feedback. They may have a chip on their shoulder because they have to protect themselves. They really don't, a lot of them don't care anymore, not all of them. They're like, oh, are these strategies really going to work? A lot of kids, by the time they get to me, are like, Mom, Dad, I've done everything. It's not going to help me. They feel defeated and get learned helplessness. So they're not really open to using those strategies because they're still a struggle, but they do help. So one of the first things I do when I work with somebody is underneath executive functioning, and this is why you don't hear this, is because schools can't do it. There are cognitive processing skills. So like, here's your house, right? Academics, And then executive functioning is under that. And then under that is cognitive processing skills, which are long-term memory, short-term memory, logic and reasoning, visual processing, auditory processing. Those are the things that you need to work on, because when you work on them and they don't do it in schools, it becomes automatic. Remember, like driving is automatic. You can type to somebody and have a conversation. In the beginning, you're learning how to drive. Now you can drive and talk to somebody, or you can, or you're thinking about your grocery list, or if you crochet, you need to get automaticity down. And you can train those, you can test those skills and you can train them, and then I retest them again and you can improve them. I have kids that are much more independent, much more emotionally happy, because going to therapy is not enough. You can talk about this stuff till the cows come home, but it's not going to change your performance, which isn't going to change your self-esteem, which isn't going to change your life of doing better.
It's about doing.
It's about doing. So, all those strategies. So what I do is, I'm kind of like, this is an expensive problem to have any of these disorders, because that you may need the help of all these different people, OT, PT, speech and language, tutors, because tutoring, you don't need a tutor. If you have a tutor long-term just to get through school, that is not the answer. That means you have cognitive processing skill problems, and that needs to be remediated. Then, like kids that can't read, some of them are in these programs like Wilson and Orton Gillingham for years. Sometimes they work, and on the individual, it depends. But auditory, if you can't discern, like dyslexia, auditory processing, and kids with NVLD can have that because it's a sensory processing disorder. All those things come in through your senses. Then you're not going to be able to read, no matter how much tutoring. So tutoring should be, after you remediate this stuff, then tutoring can work. Sometimes kids won't need it. They'll just catch up. Remember, they have average intelligence. Sometimes they may need it if they have more visual spatial problems, and then your strategies are last. Then your social skills come, because when you're processing better, you're picking up all these social cues. So it's kind of like an orchestra. In the book, I say, you need a good conductor. If some of these instruments aren't working effectively, then the whole thing, your executive functioning, isn't going to be working right. And that's what needs to work together simultaneously. And then these other strategies, like we mentioned in school, that we talked about. And, also chunking, breaking things down, time management planners. There's a ton of apps. If you're older, you can go back and go on YouTube. You can learn virtually anything on your own today. And there's Khan Academy, which there's no charge, and they really do teach in an interesting way online, and you can kind of catch up. Also, then after you remediate this, with visual spatial, when you read, you see images pop up. Well, a lot of people with NVLD don't, because of the visual spatial. So you have to build that up, and then they can start seeing images, and then, it happens automatically. You don't do it. And then you can start to comprehend better. But it depends on each individual makeup, because some people may have ADHD. But some of the other things that you can do with NVLD is you have to teach them how to do reflective listening.
Yes.
Because you need to make sure, especially at work, if you have a meeting, you need to know what you're doing. Or if the teacher's talking, a lot of kids do not want to ask questions because it's embarrassing. And if you have poor auditory processing on top of it, which is an executive underlying cognitive processing skill, by the time you get the first thing somebody said, whether it's a social arena, at any age, or learning in college or school, you missed all this stuff because you were still processing the first thing with your auditory processing speed. So you have to work on those things and get to the point where you can, process. So the reflective listening is very important, because that's impacted. So you have to teach them to say, okay, so what I understand you saying is blah, 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 blah.
Yeah. And did I get that? And is there anything else that I'm missing? Or
right?
Because, that to me, when we're talking about teens going into the young adulthood,
right,
that was a huge learning for me, to be able to communicate effectively with my kids. because they would miss a
Yeah,
lot.
yeah, right,
They couldn't see the forest. They saw only the tree. They get
right,
stuck on one point. I would say something they didn't understand the meaning of what I was saying.
right.
And as a parent, you get flustered and you can take it personally. And that was huge for me.
Oh, you're
We need to
frozen.
be
Yeah,
able to, the
yeah,
diagnosis, the
you can take it
symptoms, the
personally.
diagnosis, so important, because once you have that, you can have compassion and understanding for your child.
Exactly. And when they get older, not everybody's going to be so kind. Even teachers, just because you teach your child to self-advocate, you can't control the response of the teacher. And when they get to college, the parents cannot intervene at all because they're supposed to be, on their own. And even though they've learned how to self-advocate, that's in the book too. There's like professors that are just like, well, this isn't fair. You're getting an advantage, but you're not getting an advantage by wearing glasses. So yeah, and sometimes people may say to you, well, I already explained that to you. We went over this 3 times. And so, I teach people to say sometimes before, my brain works differently. You don't have to say you have NVLD. I
Right.
may not get everything that you're saying. And because interrupting is a big thing with ADHD and NVLD, and the reasons are different. Okay. It could be auditory processing, it could be attention, it could be not picking up nonverbal cues. But if you say to somebody, I may interrupt you or I may need to stop you because by the time I get the first thing you said, I need to process this. So please understand, I am not interrupting. I really care about what you're saying. But it's to the contrary, I want to make sure that I'm getting everything. And, you can't control people, but some people might not think you're as intelligent as you are, and
Linda,
it has nothing to do with intelligence.
what you just said was so huge, because basically what we're doing is we're teaching them self-advocacy scripts. They
Right.
don't have the words.
No, they
So you
don't.
need to be able to teach them that.
And that's the other thing. Even though you're verbally expressive with NVLD, sometimes, you're not, where you don't know how to handle a situation and you're like, I'm sure you kids will say, well, what can I say? Can I say this or can I say that? Because they're not picking up on the norms of communication or that it's okay to say this or to say that because, they didn't get all these experiences. So even though they're well spoken, they could still struggle. And then you can come in with social skills training. And even as a parent, this as a parent and social skills educator, once a week isn't going to do anything. And, a lot of times kids don't like social skills group if they're lumped in with other kids because they'll be like, Mom, the ADHD kids, she had to spend the whole time managing their behavior, or it's better to start out. And I do like an assessment. You can assess what's, there's acquisition skills and there's performance. So acquisition is, do I even know the skill before I can perform it?
Right.
So like I would assess that and then start teaching those skills and then start maybe doing it in a dyad with 2 kids. And then, but the parent must know what's going on and
Has to be involved.
They have to be highly involved. And it doesn't have to be a lot of work. And one thing I want to say is behavior modification and rewards are not going to change a neurological problem. You can use those rewards, like I have sometimes do marbles in a jar, not because you want to change and shape their behavior because it's a behavior problem. You can, they're exhausted. It's mentally draining. But you want to make them feel good and give positive reinforcement. I like the way you did that. I know it was hard to stand up for yourself and say your opinion, but you did it. And
didn't
so,
give up.
Right, you didn't give up. And maybe like reward in that way. But it's not going to change. It's for a different reason, and it's how you do it. And parents don't, all they have to do is just pay attention to what's going on. Okay, you know what, Mom or Dad, we're not mad right now. Okay, this is my tone of voice. You have to catch it in the moment. Or they may have a social problem. Social problem solving is hard. What happened? I didn't get invited. What's his name? You know him, and I love him.
Rick Lavoie?
Yeah, you knew I was going to say that. And
as you were talking, I was
writing
a lot of stuff.
Great lines think alike. I love his video, Fat City, which makes me feel like a kid with a learning disability. So parents should definitely get that. Yeah. Because they are humble.
I usually show it when I'm doing my parent support groups. I think it's brilliant.
It's brilliant. I don't know if he works much anymore, but he also says having a kid with social skills problems is like, you get the whole furniture set. You might not want this or that, the end table, but you got to deal with the whole thing. And he does social autopsies, which everybody calls it their
I
spin,
love them.
or
I
being
love
a
them.
detective. And that's what my dad did with me. He didn't know he was doing it. He was almost 100 when he died. And he didn't get to see the book, but he knew I was writing it. But he praised me. I was very impulsive. He'd be like, that's my Linda, one step ahead of everybody else. And I have this whole theory that neurodivergent, it is not better or worse. It's different. And it doesn't mean the movers and shakers are the ones that change the world.
That's right.
And so if we were it's all majority minority. If we were the majority of people, the other people would have the disorder because there's a smaller portion of us. And it's easier to teach to the middle to try to reach everybody. I know that as a teacher. And the research says most teachers teach the way that they learn.
Right.
And so they teach in a way that's not effective, but it's not better. It's a shame that it has come down to that people are neurodivergent that are looked down upon, but it is starting to change slowly but surely because it's the newer terminology, which I got off tangent. But anyway, my dad did that, and he would talk everything through with me and break it down. And, I would assume a lot of things like, well, Dad, they don't like me. Well, you don't really know that because you weren't there. You can't read minds. You can't make assumptions. And he would use his tone of voice, and he would say different words, and he just knew what to do with no training. He just was, we talked a lot. There wasn't a lot of, running to all these sports activities like today. You could more like be a kid. There wasn't all this technology. So just spend the time, have dinner. That's a big deal. Research says have dinner together. It's really hard for younger parents because they want to do all these, but that's not important. No. Sports does teach social skills, and it's important, but do you have to be in everyone and keep up with everybody else? Your kids get tired. They get a mental fatigue from trying to, you see this, keep up with everybody else. They come home, they need downtime. And pushing and pushing and pushing is going to cause them to snap.
Yeah, and they need connection.
And they need connection.
Dr. Hallowell calls it the vitamin C. It's so important.
Oh, I love him. He endorsed the book. I love him. And you need to do a lot of talking and explaining things that are not explained. Like, something that happened, like, although this person didn't say that, this is what it means when somebody says that. Nobody's going to teach you before you leave the house and, always say, look at your hair.
Linda, in your book, there is this magnificent poem that really spoke to me. I'm wondering if you can share it with our viewers.
Oh, sure, because it really changed my life. Okay, so I came across this poem I think I was in my 20s, and I was, struggling so much. And of course I didn't identify, we didn't know about neurodivergency then. And it wasn't specifically about NVLD, but it just spoke to me and it helped me. Now there is a line in the poem, and it's called Autobiography in 5 Short Chapters by Portia Nelson. There is something that says, it is my fault. And I don't want people to take it that way. And I put in the book, it doesn't mean it's your fault. The message for me was, and still is, even though NVLD wasn't my fault, I am responsible for managing my responses to the problems NVLD caused me. And I hope this poem provides you with the same comfort and inspiration as it did for me. And it's the autobiography in 5 chapters. Chapter 1, I walk down the street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I fall in. I'm lost and I'm hopeless. It isn't my fault. It takes forever to find my way out. Chapter 2, I walk down the same street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I pretend I don't see it. I fall in again. I can't believe I'm in the same place. But it isn't my fault. It still takes me a long time to get out. Chapter 3, I walk down the same street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I see it's there. I still fall in, but it's a habit. My eyes are open. I know where I am. It is my fault. I get out immediately. Chapter 4, I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I walk around it. Chapter 5, I walk down another street. And this really hit home because people with ADHD, executive functioning, and even NVLD who are so lost because they don't always understand what's going on around them, it takes longer for them to learn things. Much, much, much longer. And they don't always learn from their mistakes. But eventually, and they may not even see that they have an issue because they have a chip on their shoulder and they think it's everybody else's fault. But eventually, when you keep having problems with different people that don't know each other in different situations, you do come to the realization, it must be me, something. And when you come to that, it's a blessing. And so you may need to let your kids fail. I mean, it could be till they're 25, 27, the brain's still growing, until they come to that conclusion. Then you can make progress. And next time we'll have to talk about that whole thing, kids living at home when they're older and they're not helping themselves. That's a whole nother thing. But
Oh, yeah, there's so much.
This really, and you can read this to your
Hold
kids.
on. You have to get this book. Linda, all I can say is it has been such an honor and a pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your time.
Thank you so much for having me and helping me spread my mission about NVLD so people can get identified and move on and live their best lives.
Thank you.
Thanks.